When I was in elementary school, I shared a queen-size bed with my older sister and our family dog, a mutt that looked like a short-haired lassie, and would sleep at the foot of our bed every night. When I was about 6 years old, I woke up one night around midnight and saw a dark figure standing at the foot of the bed. The figure was entirely in black without any eyes or face. I tried to wake my sister up, but she rolled over to go back to sleep. My sister must have accidentally kicked the dog because the dog woke up and raised her head and started growling at the figure at the foot of the bed. The growling then woke my sister up and she saw the figure and started screaming. When my parents came into the room and turned on the light, nothing was there. Growing up, my older brother had a computer program that he used to compose piano music on. I remember I was reading in the living room when I heard the most beautiful violin melody I have ever heard. I listened to the whole thing, which was several minutes long. I walked down the hallway to compliment my brother on his masterpiece when I realized my brother was not even using the computer, and I was home alone, all by myself. Lived in an old 2-bedroom, 3-story walk-up for a time in my early 20s in Toronto. A few days after moving in, my roommate Mike decides to get after me in the morning for banging on the wall that separated our bedrooms and pacing back and forth across the apartment at night. We just agreed he must have been dreaming, or it was sounds from the other apartments, as I had done no such thing. We agreed that it must have been nothing and left it at that, but this became a regular nightly occurrence. Shortly thereafter, I started noticing at certain times in my own bedroom the cloying smell of cheap woman's perfume mixed with a damp, musty smell. Imagine an old person's clothes left on a damp, musty basement floor near a litter box that wasn't being changed often enough, and you get the idea. What made it even weirder is that I would be filled with a sudden, horrible sense of foreboding a few moments before the smell would begin. My grandfather was a very, very bad person. Alcoholic, extremely physically violent, tried to kill my grandmother in front of their kids. One of his less horrible acts was abandoning my grandmother with their 6 kids, all under the age of 12. Some of his kids maintained minimal contact with him. He lived about 30 or 40 miles from my grandmother and the 2 kids who'd stayed in the area. When he was in his 80s, he was hospitalized and then passed away in the middle of the night. In the morning, his oldest child, one of my aunts, went to the morgue to identify the body and fill out the paperwork. On her way, she stopped by my grandmother's to break the news. When she came in, my grandmother said, "Oh, it's a sad day. He died just past midnight, I imagine." My grandmother had begun to show some signs of dementia, or just basic old age, so the weird comments weren't too out of character. And my aunt assumed that the hospital, one of her siblings had already called to tell their mother the news. My aunt shook it off and drove to the morgue like normal. When she saw the death certificate, she was shocked to see the time of death listed at 12:10 a.m. And on her way home, she stopped back at my grandmother's and asked her who had called her to tell her the news, and asked why she had said that she thought he died just past midnight. My grandmother said, "He came to see me at 12:30 and we talked for a spell. He wanted to apologize for all he'd done to me and you and the kids. I think he made his peace and was able to move on, so I'm glad for that." My grandmother then resumed humming and doing a jigsaw puzzle. So, this happened to me when I was only 17. When I was still living at my childhood home, I was sneaking out late at night to meet some friends of mine. I went through the back door of the house, and as I turned to face the door, I could just feel somebody watching me. I thought I was busted. I turned to look at who had caught me, and saw a totally monochrome figure. The hair was completely black, like blacker than black, and her face was like a static washed over white gray, and she was wearing a dress that was in between the 2 colors. No facial features though, just a silhouette of a young girl facing me. I reached for the door as fast as I could, and when I went to shut it, it closed very quickly on me. I bolted through my yard and onto the street and couldn't shake the feeling I was being followed. I stayed at my friend's that night. Soon after this happened, I was up late with my mother watching a movie. My dad had just passed away. We finish our movie up and say goodnight after turning the TV, stereo receiver, and DVD player. After a short amount of time in bed, I'm jarred awake by the sound of static with the speakers cranked up on the TV with no input. My mom and I meet in the hallway, surprised to see that we had both been awoken to an empty house. Just told this story of mine to a coworker. I was around 7 years old, and it was near the holidays, I remember. The house I grew up in has a downstairs and a basement, so I left my pillow downstairs after a long movie binge and went to grab it later that evening. Grab the pillow and look up. I see a man on the other side of the room dressed to the nines, just looking around, paying no attention to me. Weird thing was, he was entirely gray. Head to toe, skin color, and everything, just totally gray. I'm staring, jaw wide open, completely petrified with fright. He looks up at me and notices I'm able to see him and drops his jaw lower than humanly normal, almost as if he was screaming at me, but without sound. He then ran through the wall and disappeared. I wasn't able to go downstairs if the lights were off until I was a teenager. Lived in a haunted apartment. It was 2 rooms, but one of the rooms was locked and I didn't have the key. So I only had one small room as kitchen, dining room and bedroom, and a screened-in porch. There were 2 especially freaky events. One night, my girlfriend slept over and she woke up in the middle of the night and said she saw the bathroom door open and a shadowy figure standing in the bathroom, staring at her. The bathroom was right across from the locked room. Another time, I was jerked awake by the fire alarm going off, just blaring. But when I went to unplug it, the alarm stopped and no other alarm in the building was going off. A lot of the things that happened could have just been my neighbors, but the way they happened was, well, weird. I would hear knocking. It sounded like someone tapping a spoon on a counter. Coming from the downstairs apartment, actually. It could have been my neighbor, but I'm not sure why she would do that every couple of minutes for hours on end, or in the middle of the night. I would also hear knocking on the walls. It sounded like someone tapping their way up the wall, like they were looking for a stud. I would also hear this weird moaning howling that I couldn't trace the source of. Again, it could have been a neighbor's dog, but it didn't sound like it was coming from her apartment. The apartment across from me had 3 tenants in a year, and I think because it was just as or more haunted than mine. When I was about 16 years old, I encountered something that still bugs me to this day. I woke up around 6 a.m. on a normal weekday and went downstairs to get ready for school. No one else in my family had woken up at this point. I got in the shower, still sleepy and could barely hold my eyes open. After a few minutes of showering, someone tried to get it and I told whoever it was that I was in the shower. The person then proceeded to aggressively open the door. I saw the door handle going up and down like crazy, and he, she, whatever, knocked on the door harder and harder. And then it suddenly stopped. I didn't think that much about it, but when I got out of the shower, I realized that nobody was even up yet. So I proceeded with eating breakfast. And after a while, my dad came down the stairs, and so I asked him if it was he who had wanted to use the bathroom earlier. He said no, and that both my mom and younger brother was still asleep, so it could not have been them either. And even if it had been any of my family member, they would have not tried to open the door so aggressively. This didn't happen to me, but it actually happened to my father. We used to live in a home that was part of the underground railroad. It has a few hidden crawl spaces around the house that was being used as a storage in the present. While we lived there, my brother started sleepwalking and talking. One night, while my parents were sleeping, they heard my little brother scream from my bedroom, even though he slept downstairs. My dad ran up there, but my bedroom door was closed, like something was blocking it, so he kicked the door open. But when he kicked the door open, a shadow ran past him and my room was ice cold. My brother was laying on my bed, pointing at the closet, screaming, "Get her, Daddy, get her!" My dad looked but saw nothing but darkness. quickly picked up my brother, who was stiff as a board, covered in sweat, and ran out. When my brother finally woke up that morning, he remembered that nothing had happened. After we moved out, he stopped sleepwalking entirely. A few years back, while I was sleeping, I had a nightmare of an old lady that was attacking me. She looked like one of the typical horror movie old witches with accented wrinkles and whatnot. Anyway, after that night, I woke up to use the bathroom, and on my way there, my grandfather had stopped me. He told me to turn around so he could have a better look at my back. I would sleep without a shirt on and called my parents over to see a big handprint on the left side of my back, as if someone slapped really hard, and asked them if they were hitting me. Of course they weren't, and I assured my grandfather it wasn't them. Later that day, though, I also noticed 3 scratch marks, very lightly, barely noticeable, on my chest, and to this day I have no idea what it was. By the way, the mark cleared up after about 3 or so days. Not me, but a friend of mine told me about a dream she had years ago about a decrepit old man who was being chased by wolves. In the dream, he kept referring to himself in third person as Old Skin. Eventually, the wolves caught up to him and started ripping him to pieces in front of her, and he kept narrating the events in a monotone voice. Old Skin's being eaten alive. Old Skin's gonna die. She woke up feeling creeped out, but the weirdest part came when she started describing the dream to her brother. He stopped her mid-sentence and asked, "What is his name, Old Skin?" I had the exact same dream. When I was really young, maybe 4 or 5, I remember having one specific nightmare that woke me up in the middle of the night. I was in some sort of theater with red curtains and gold trim, and a red tiki-ish mask floating by itself was coming very fast towards my face, which ended up waking me up. Now, a few weeks ago, I attended a concert in a theater. I've never been there before and was pretty excited. However, after about 30 minutes into the concert, I looked around and then back at the screen, which had some visuals that went well with the music. On the screen was the same red tiki mask I'd seen as a child. All of a sudden, my heart just dropped, and my whole body seemed to tense up immediately. I realized I had been in this theater before, and I feel like my dream I had as a child was of that exact moment. I do see spirits fairly often, both visually and just a feeling, if that helps. I've heard of deja vus before, but never from a dream. Just looking to get another opinion on all of this. I can answer any more questions, thank you. I was a seasonal worker at Lake Powell. For those who don't know about Lake Powell, it's a beautiful lake that stretches through Utah and Arizona. It was an extremely popular vacation spot from the 70s all the way into the 90s. Lake Powell was created because of the Glen Canyon Dam. When the water started filling the canyon after the dam was completed, it destroyed so much Navajo, Ute, and Peyote history. Natives obviously didn't want the dam built. I worked at the Halls Crossing store. The Halls Crossing is extremely secluded. There was the big marina and its store, and then our little shack down a few miles down the road. Our little store actually had a rentable RV spots and mini houses for people who were there to vacation. Please keep in mind through this story that no one could be in or around the store without me seeing. It's too small and too barren of a property for people to play tricks and hide. A couple of months into working there, I was closing alone. It was dusk, and I started cleaning the store. I went out to grab a vacuum, brought it in, hit the power button. It didn't work. I made an out of order sign to remind me to ask about having it fixed. I went and got the other vacuum, and the same thing happened, so I wrote down a request to fix that one too. I set both the vacuums on the store's porch and set a broom out there too. So I could clear it of the day's dirt. It was leaning against the railing of the porch. I took the vacuums back to the shed. As I was putting them back, I heard a large thud come from the inside of the store that isn't larger than a living room. It sounded like a gallon of bleach falling onto the floor. I thought someone might have come in the store while I was in the shed, so I hurried back within seconds of hearing the thud, and I didn't see anyone. but the broom I put against the rails had made it up through the handle. It was tucked so well into the handle that it hovered a couple inches above the ground. At this point, I was mildly freaked out by that, but what made it worse was that a few nights before that I had an extremely bad night terror. The only thing that happened in my dream was a large shadow in the shape of a malformed person in the corner of the room as I stared at it. I didn't feel scared in the dream, but it didn't feel good. A couple of weeks pass and I let it go. The story as a fun, kooky little ghost story. Then I go home for the weekend, and everything's normal, and as Friday night comes to a close, I settle down for bed. I turn out the lights and lay down. Nothing felt wrong. I felt the ends of my hair move slightly, but I didn't. Then my hair moves again, except the hair that was over my face lifts up. If you have longer hair, grab the ends and lift them. I saw that and felt it. I don't remember how I felt from that. Soon after my hair was lifted, I fell asleep almost instantly. Like I had just taken a bottle of cold medicine, or something along those lines. After I quit Lake Powell, it stopped, and I haven't experienced anything like that since. Around 2 years ago, I was sitting in my bed, getting ready to go to sleep, when I started hearing a very loud banging noise coming from my attic. The noise sounded like someone stamping their foot on the wooden floor. From what I remember, it was coming from directly above my door. For reference, the entrance to the attic is just outside my door. This happened 4 times, with the last time being around 10 months ago. At first, I thought it might be a broken pipe in the attic, or maybe it was wind for all I know. But what makes me think otherwise is that when I've tried to record it, it just stops abruptly until I turn off the camera. I'm not really convinced that it was a ghost, but some opinions on the situation would be appreciated. So, I live with my best friend. She was gone and her kid was 100% asleep in their own room. At exactly 1 a.m., I started to hear a clear, faint but echoing bell ding, just a single ding. I investigated the noise but could not find a reliable source. The dinging stopped after I left my room, so I decided to go to the bathroom, and it started back up until I left the bathroom. Now it stopped entirely. I can't tell my best friend, she will flip her lid. I'm not afraid of ghosts, but it did alarm me slightly. Not to mention, that wasn't the only weird thing that happened tonight, but it was the most relevant. Recently, I'm beginning to question whether or not my house is haunted due to many unexplainable occurrences that have been happening recently, and I hope you all can set my mind at ease, or make me feel a whole lot worse. This all started about a week ago, when I went to my sister's room to ask her a question about something. As we were standing there talking, we both heard a noise under her bed that sounded exactly like our dog sighing. We thought this was funny and had a bit of a laugh about it before lifting up her comforter to look at her. My dog wasn't there. My sister and I managed to laugh it off, but it's still stuck in my mind as bizarre. I mean, that's not something I can just ignore, so it set my nerves on end after that. A few days later, I was playing Battlefield 5 on the first story of my house, and I heard the front door open. I just assumed it was my dad, who had just gotten home from work. Since his job sucks, I usually drop whatever I'm doing just to quickly greet him and return to what I was doing. So, as I took my headset off, I heard what sounded like someone opening the fridge. Nothing weird, my dad's normally hungry when he gets home, so I don't think anything of it. But I walk into the kitchen, and my dad isn't there. But the fridge is open. I'm shaken up after this, and I run to the front door and outside. My dad's truck isn't even there. After that, I refuse to even play video games downstairs when I'm home alone. For the last week, everything was quiet until today. Today, my sister was sitting in the living room and she heard a loud pop from the kitchen. When she enters the kitchen, there's a brown liquid seeping from under the kitchen sink. She immediately thinks a pipe or something busted and opens the cupboard. Instead of a broken pipe, there's a Coke can with the top blown clean off. I'm not just the tab where you open it. The whole top just decided to come off. For background info on my house, we have been the only owners and it was built 25 years ago. However, we know that at least a small Civil War battle was fought in the woods behind my house, as there are trenches and we have found musket balls in the backyard. Do y'all think I've got a ghost on my house? And if so, what should I do?